What's going on, everybody? I'm Tony East. I cover the Fever for the Next. Wrote lots of stories about them, covered them for 5 years. And I want to talk about the playoffs. This is the first time the Fever have been in the playoffs since I've been covering them and since Tamika Catchings played for the team. And I want to do video reviews of the games and what I think the Fever can do better. They got smoked by the Sun in Game 1. There's no way to sugarcoat it, but it's not that hard for me to imagine ways that they could be at least far more competitive in the second game, even though I don't necessarily know how easy it's going to be for them to actually win. I've been telling people on radio interviews privately that I think Connecticut was one of the hardest matchups for the Fever in the whole league. In terms of first-round opponents, they have competitive, strong defensive guards. They have size who can defend at every position. That's why they led the league in defensive rating. And yet, the Fever still beat them once during the regular season in a way that had people feeling confident about how the series could go for Caitlin Clark and company. And I want to talk about this first game under the guise of what I think people have been getting wrong and what I think people have been getting right about what went wrong for the Fever in the first game. They lost by 24 points, and the Fever were 6 for 28 from three. And I think a lot of people have said, oh, they lost because they did not shoot well from deep. And obviously shooting better is better than shooting worse, but if the Fever shot 50% from three in this game, which is amazing, they still would not have won. They would have been tied and gone to overtime. That is not even close to me to the reason the Fever lost this game. The Fever in general shot 40.3% from the field. They were much better on twos. Connecticut shot nearly 50%. To me, the reason the Fever could not do what they wanted in this game was that their whole offensive structure was not at the level it needed to be, or the threateningness that it had in the game. They did beat Connecticut. And some of that is threes. I don't want to belittle that, but a lot of that is a lot of other stuff. Like, it wasn't as zippy with the passing. They had 23 assists on 27 made shots. That sounds great, but only 27 made shots kind of shows you how much of a struggle it was for them to generate the looks that they normally do, or the looks that they like to get on a given game. So some of that is the way Connecticut likes to play is they switch on defense really, really far from the basket. They switch on defense. No matter who was setting the screen for the Fever or who the receiver of the screen was for the Fever, Connecticut, their really strong defensive group, could switch that up high, right? So sometimes even Bree Jones, that was very rare, but the center for the Sun would get up into the ball handler's face, show for a little bit, and then drop back to her man, whoever that was, Aaliyah Boston, Tammy Fagbend, Damiris Dantas, whoever, and she did a wonderful job with that, and that forces Caitlin Clark or Kelsey Mitchell or whoever the ball handler is, Erica Wheeler sometimes, to think, to react, to say, where is this opening? How can we get this done, right? And that was really effective from them, and that was on top of Connecticut's initial adjustment of putting DeWanna Bonner on Caitlin Clark. One thing that made me think this Connecticut series would be tough for Indiana is during the regular season, the Ty Harris, Dejanay Carrington backcourt was as good as it gets in terms of defending Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell in tandem. Ty Harris obviously got hurt very early in the game. Veronica Burton did a wonderful job filling in with that defensive role. And of course, Marina Mabry played very well, filling in as the other guard. But I just thought in general, that's something that would make this series challenging for the Fever. If you go back to the game the Fever won, and this is a regular season game, it's very different. Connecticut is battle-tested. They reached the finals 2 years ago. Their core's very strong. The Fever were 8 for 24 from deep that night, right? That is more about what I'm saying. It's not about shooting. The Fever shot 45.5% that game and had 19 assists on their 30 makes. What they did better that game, a couple things that I want to point out. They had 20 assists on their 31 makes. I'm not very good at reading, apparently. One thing they did very well in this game, for those of you who remember this stretch or watch a lot of Fever games, is this was the stretch of the season where Aaliyah Boston's passing was at its best by far. She had a couple of games with this 6, 8, 7 assist kind of range where she would roll after setting a screen, catch, turn, face the basket, and I thought Aaliyah Boston had a pretty okay game one, especially on the offensive end for the Fever, 8 for 14 with a double-double. But her passing in this game, 3 assists. That's solid, but you could see that she was more aware of what the passing options were in this first game against the Sun and the way they like to switch. So even though Boston wasn't scoring as much, she only had 10 points. She had the 8 assists. She had 4 steals, right? She just was more impactful top to bottom. And I'm not saying she played bad. Everybody on the Fever could play better. But that kind of short roll passing is one way to beat the switches, or one way to beat those shows when Bree Jones or whoever the big is defending the screeners coming up to show Caitlin Clark hands, to show Kelsey Mitchell hands, right? That is a way to counter that, is you get the ball to the big, because the ball can move faster than any player on the court, and then Aaliyah Boston moves it again. So the Sun defense has to be in rotation all the time. To be clear, the Fever were 13 for 30 in this win over Connecticut. I was looking at the wrong team's box score. So either way, that's one thing I think that the Fever would like to get to more in Game 2 is getting the ball to Aaliyah Boston and letting her facilitate a bit, or at least playing through her, right? Even if she catches, turns, and faces, and there's nothing there, turn right back around, flow into a handoff with Caitlin. If the big, or Kelsey Mitchell, who actually played solidly in game one as well, if the big is going to be running that much between ball handler and screener and someone has to rotate low, there's either a shooter open or a big is open. And that is what the Fever have to figure out is if the big is open, Aaliyah needs to score, and if someone else is open, Aaliyah needs to find that pass. The other thing that was clicking very well for the Fever at this time and in general really throughout the season that's been really threatening for them is guard-guard actions. Kelsey Mitchell and Caitlin Clark working in tandem, whether it's Iverson cuts, blur screens, any sort of thing like that that makes a defense react to an exchange between Caitlin Clark and Kelsey Mitchell. I asked Christy Sides about that earlier this season. She said something the team studied, her staff studied, was the Golden State Warriors, right, with Steph and Clay. Two great shooters, two speedy players who force defenses to think and react. How did they get their players open? And in that game, neither Clark or Mitchell had like awesome shooting games. They were both pretty good. 8 for 14 for Mitchell, 7 for 17 from Clark in the game that the Fever beat Connecticut. But they just were more involved. They had the ball in their hands. They were forcing Connecticut to do stuff. They got up 19 combined threes. And so that is, I think, another thing the Fever could get more stuff in is if you're going to see all this switching, before the switch comes, instantly have Clark and Mitchell do some sort of exchange or interaction that makes the defense react and then immediately react to another screen, to more action so that the Sun of the team reacting to what the Fever are doing offensively and not what happened in game one of the series, which was the Fever reacting to what the Sun were doing defensively. So that to me is the headliner because obviously shooting matters. The Fever made 13 threes when they beat the Sun. They only made 6 in this last game. But if they made 13 in this game, they still would have lost. So that's factor one to me is how do they beat this defense that, to be fair to the Fever, has given everybody fits. Connecticut's defense was the best in the league this season. They're tremendous on that end of the floor. They have size and discipline, and they communicate. The other thing is they have to defend better. 93 points is so much. For a Connecticut team that is good on the offensive end, I think they finished 5th in offensive rating roughly, but not so good that they should give the Fever this many fits. What can they do better, right? Because if you look back at this game, it wasn't like Alyssa Thomas was amazing. She was 6 for 15. That's good. She had a triple-double. I'm not going to say she wasn't amazing. She's an incredible player, but like that's not an efficient night. Bree Jones was 2 for 7. Ty Harris missed her only shot before she got hurt, right? That's 3 starters combined, for Connecticut. That went 8 for 23. That's about a third of their shots. Dejanay Carrington was pretty solid at 6 for 12, and Duana Bonner was amazing with her 22 points. But it's not like the starters were so absurdly above expectations as a unit. But Mabry cooked the Fever all night. Nelson Adoa didn't miss a shot all night. Veronica Burton was really good, only missed 1 shot throughout the game. Their bench was really impactful. And so to me, if you look at the other adjustment for the Fever, and this is what they talk about all year, they have to guard better. And it's not just about what that does for your defense. Duh, you would like to give up fewer points. Everybody wants to give up fewer points. But the Fever need to specifically, one, because they got torn up by the Sun, who shot nearly 50% from the field. But 2 is the Fever are at their best when they can play quick, when they can play in the open floor, when Caitlin can see all her options, when Kelsey Mitchell can run behind the defense, when shooters can run to the corners. Even in semi-transition, after a make, if they can go fast, that's great. They can get shots quick in possessions. That's why their pace was so good. That's when the Fever hit their stride this season, is when their offense and their transition was super well connected, given the speed of their players. That requires at least somewhat competent defense. If you're getting cooked and taking the ball out of that over and over, it's much harder to get into that style of play. Just general defense, right? I didn't think the Fever game plan wise was doing anything that I thought, oh, that makes no sense to me from a defensive perspective. They were really loading up on the strong side, forcing Connecticut to limit their actions to 2 players. They did a pretty good job in terms of communication. I never felt like the Sun were just wide open way too often. But Christy Sides did not like the closeouts her team had. Some of them too short, some of them too aggressive. The hands weren't up enough. They weren't being forceful enough. They weren't forcing the Sun to react. I thought Aaliyah Boston made Bree Jones have a tough night. But other than that, I didn't think the Fever were at the defensive level they needed to be. And given what their style is, that should be the top of list item for game 2. Because I think a lot of the stuff I said about offense will come if the defense is much better. So, all that being said, the Fever were happy with the shots they got. And I think that was a key takeaway, too, when people talked about the shooting. A lot of Caitlin's threes that she missed were good looks, shots that she would like, shots that she can make. That's why she was so frustrated to me in the third quarter when you could see her smacking her chair on the bench. And a lot of players fell victim to the same thing. Kelsey Mitchell has been shooting lights out all year, 2 for 10 from deep. Lexi Hall, who was the best shooter in the WNBA after the Olympic break, she missed both of her threes in this game. Dantas was the only reliable shooter for the Fever in this game, but also only 4 players even took threes for the Fever in this game. More testament to the way Connecticut was defending, more testament to the way that they were enticing the Fever to play into their hands, and the Fever need to get out of that. So if I had to summarize what I think the Fever need to do better in Game 2 on Wednesday night to win, to get the series back to Indiana, to give them a chance to move on to the second round, it would be 1, play with a little more tempo, keep it moving. 2, Aaliyah Boston's got to be more involved as a decision maker, not necessarily just as a passer, but just put her in spots where she can get a shot up from the elbow or the free throw line, distribute to the open shooter since Connecticut's in rotation, or just immediately flip back into some handoff or screen action with the guard. 3, make Kelsey Mitchell and Caitlin Clark play together, connected basketball. They're so talented. They need to be intertwined in a way that forces a defense to panic. And lastly, they just got to guard better. I don't think they systematically did anything wrong defensively. I don't think they executed very well, though. Just better defense, more disciplined defense, more hands, force the Sun to think, to react, to be the team forcing the other team to react. And the Fever can win this. They've beaten the Sun before with their offense as strong as it can be. They can beat anybody, but they got smoked in Game 1. They'll have to be better in Game 2. We'll have more coverage of the Fever, including press conferences, behind-the-scenes insights right here on this YouTube channel and over at The Next, where you can find all my writing. I'll be having a story up about Game 1 either on Tuesday or Wednesday morning. Thank you all for watching this. We will be back with more Fever coverage on this channel. Thank you.